Video game collecting is in a weird place right now. As the inexorable march towards an all-digital future continues, physical games are becoming less relevant and more expensive. It's no secret that the pandemic opened the floodgates to the wrong type of collector: hedge funds, speculators, and those who see collecting as a long-term investment rather than a personal passion project, and in subsequent years this has shown no sign of abating. It's safe to say that we're on the precipice of a major paradigm shift in terms of our relationship, not just to physical games, but to physical media in general. And I think it's bad for the scene, bad for collectors, and bad for our relationship to media and art and how we perceive its intrinsic value. But first, let's look at how we got here. I've spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about the important things in life, such as why I'm so obsessed with video games and collecting, and why it's derailing my life. I jest. Seriously though, it's an interesting topic. I alluded a little bit to this in my initial SNES collecting vid, that the catalyst for me was that I'd been to a friend's house, that they'd opened a drawer full of SNES games, and it had made me want to collect, even before I really knew anything about collecting. You see, back then, and contrary to some modern suppositions, you generally got a game or two for your birthday and the same for Christmas, meaning if you ended up with an absolute duffer, you still took the time to immerse yourself, exploring every nook and cranny, maximising its value, because, to put it bluntly, that was your lot. At least until the next Christmas or birthday. Given that technology was moving at a rapid pace in the 90s and early 2000s, it meant that most console life cycles were 5 years at a push, and because you didn't have disposable income as a kid, this meant that unless you were a richie rich, you couldn't build a sizable collection. So what did you do when you wanted to play more games? You lent them from friends, you rented from VHS rental stores, you hustled, and this meant that oftentimes you only got a tantalising glimpse of a much bigger world out there. I distinctly remember lending a PS1 from a friend in the late 90s, and even though I was a certified N64-aholic, part of me, deep in the recesses of my consciousness, thought that Croc, Legend of the Gobos, was the shit, and was devastated when I had to give it back before completing it. Something that still keeps me up to this very day. These brief tastes of a bigger world meant that when you finally started making your own hard-earned cash, you thought back to all those games you saw in magazines or in VHS rental stores that you couldn't buy then, that you now could, and it opened the floodgates to systems like Sega Saturn and Neo Geo Pocket that you might have missed first time around. VHS rental stores in particular had a looming presence over video game collecting. If you aren't old enough to remember, it's impossible to overstate just how big of a presence these stores had on our lives. They were a cultural institution in the 80s and 90s, and in many ways defined the era, with families picking up the latest VHS tapes every weekend, and let me tell you, being in those stores was a special experience. Every kid of that era has vivid memories of picking up the boxes, the horrors and video nasties far beyond their mental maturity, reading the back and getting a glimpse into the black void of the unknown, wondering, fearing, doubting, surrounded by what felt like an endless array of movies. And in these hallowed halls, games were also available, meaning you didn't have to just rely on friends to play the latest and greatest. You could get your weekend fix, and though you'd likely not beat a game in a single weekend, those memories stayed with a lot of modern collectors, getting that taste and wanted more. One of the major generational shifts I've noticed with regards to games is that youngsters not only are mostly indifferent towards collecting, but they place less of an impetus on physical media in general. And it's understandable, particularly when viewed through the rose-tinted lens of a much better time, and our relationship to media in general back then. We were surrounded by physical media, and ownership was a big part of that. Whereas today, you can boot up a streaming service in seconds and be greeted by a wall of thousands and thousands of movies and TV shows. Back then, you made do with what you had, and you recorded what you didn't off TV, ads and all. It was a different time. And I think a large part of this modern indifference comes from that. Kids back then didn't have a lot of choice, and so they made the most of the limited avenues they had, whereas kids today are flooded by choice. From services like Game Pass and PlayStation Plus to free-to-play games and absurd digital sales, there's something for everyone, and the barrier to entry has never been lower. This means that there's less reverence not only for collecting physically, but also for art in general. One of the core themes of Brave New World is superfluous consumption. The idea that, to maintain economic growth, citizens should consume with wanton abandon for the greater good and should always be looking for the next dopamine hit. In fact, it's one of the central tenets of the world state in that book, and it's enforced through hypnopedia, which helps condition citizens into always wanting more, regardless of their present circumstances, thus making them easier to control and manipulate. You're probably wondering where I'm going with this, so let me elaborate. While people throw out the term Orwellian without really having a firm understanding of what Orwell was warning against, similarly, Brave New World barely gets a look in modern discourse, despite, in my opinion, being far more prescient and representative of modern society than 1984 ever was. Just look at how almost all forms of artistic expression, from writing to painting and drawing to directing and editing to photography, has been bucketed under content in modern lexicon. Such a reductionist approach strips away the personality, the creativity, the artistic expression, and most of all the humanity, and unfortunately we now live in a world where consumption is the name of the game, and we're constantly chasing that next dopamine hit. Thus, we place less significance on art and media in general. When you can press 2 buttons and immediately be greeted with thousands of hours of entertainment compared to, say, having to wait, sometimes for months on end, for a film to come on TV so you can watch it, of course you're going to put less of an impetus on the creative process. Combine that with younger generations that have grown up in a world dominated by the internet and digital media, and what will ultimately transpire is that physical media will become less and less relevant, and this will have a knock-on effect on how we perceive art and its value relative to the human experience. Whereas we grew up surrounded by physical media, new generations will never have that connection, and so physical collecting will become less alluring as time marches on. Now I know what you're thinking. How can you critique modern day consumption habits when video game collecting, by its very nature, is unbridled consumption? And you'd have a point. But many physical collections are a drop in the ocean compared to digital collections, and the argument is less about that than how, with the rise of social media, society has shifted in some fairly dramatic ways. Shortening attention spans, constant dopamine hits, and an ocean of choice without very many friction or pain points along the way. You can access millions of songs on Spotify and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of movies and TV shows on Netflix, and digital games are far less hassle than physical games. So unless you're a diehard, there's little need to build a hefty collection. And this leads me to my next point. Most people started building collections long before digital was even a thing, and the reason they did so was because there was no way to play these games otherwise. But today, companies like Night Dive are remastering these old games, fixing the bugs and ironing out the kinks, giving the modern player a new and enhanced way to play them, oftentimes through objectively better experiences. Why would you play, say, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver on the PS1 when you can pick up the first 2 games as part of a remastered collection with improved visuals and a modern control scheme? And this will keep happening. When games like The Thing and Star Wars Dark Forces are getting the full remaster treatment, it means that all games are on the table. Though I loathe the likes of limited run games and their awful FOMO model, I can't help but be impressed when I see stuff like Blade Runner, an old and very much fundamentally broken PC point and click game, getting the remaster treatment, nodding along in appreciative bliss, and thinking, what a time to be alive. Still not buying it though, limited run can go suck a If you're an avid collector or have just been following the scene for a long time, you'll notice the trends come and go, particularly in terms of what's in demand at any given time. And this nearly always coincides with generations coming of age. Basically, the games they played as kids start shooting up in value as they get older, and they begin to start buying them up. Most recently this happened with the GameCube, and it couldn't have happened to a finer machine. The GC, for all its faults, was such a good machine. From the Capcom 5, the Link and Soul Calibur 2, the multiplayer sessions of Time Splitters 2, the underrated little RPG gems like Bite Kaidos. It was a delightful little machine, and I'm glad it had its day in the sun, at least retrospectively, that is. These days, despite being probably the cheapest console besides the PS2 to collect for, the Xbox 360 is starting to jump up in value. As with most things collecting related, it'll ebb and flow and prices may never drop substantially. After all, the market always goes up, but the mania will eventually subside and all will be right with the world again. But the key question remains, what next? The PS4 will likely be the next big hitter, but after that, all we're really left with is the Switch, and with Nintendo being one of the few who still focus on the physical market, even that's beginning to shift with the Switch too. Its days could well be numbered, meaning that the baton, which has been passed between generations for decades, may have nowhere to go, as the ease, convenience, and sheer variety of digital make it the consumer's option of choice. The subject of the perils of an all-digital future are not within the purview of this video, and perhaps I'll discuss it another time, but part of the allure of collecting is that the value is determined by the seller and the market demand. Sure, digital sales are absurdly good value presently, but we're seeing a shift to $70 games and above, and less choice equals more anti-consumer policies and practices. When you have one store which dictates the price and you don't have the safety net of the middleman in terms of brick and mortar retail stores or the pre-owned market to help make things more affordable, it can only be a bad thing for the consumer. So, what does the future hold? Combining mindless mass assumption with a market that is placing less and less value on physical ownership, that doesn't have the same childhood awe of the likes of video game stores or rental stores, means that while prices are never likely to come down, the market will shrink and there'll be less demand. It's entirely possible that it can rebound like records have in recent times. These things come in cycles after all, but it'll likely be the diehards and the capitalists battling it out for the scraps of the table. And in a way, that's sad. Certain games will never get a digital release or remaster, and those games shouldn't be left to the annals of time. Sure, you can play on emulator, but it's not the same, especially when it comes to console gaming. There's no feeling quite like booting up your original PS2, hearing that opening jingle, going into the woof, and then getting stuck into a classic. No save states, no modern controls, no mods. The way it was meant to be. And if we lose that, then we lose a key part of what makes gaming so special. These machines deserve love, and they deserve attention, and their catalogue shouldn't be forgotten for the sake of convenience. We'll see what the future holds. I'm not exactly optimistic, but hey, let's look on the bright side. Less demand equals more goodies for us. The idea of this series is to revisit this topic periodically to see what has changed and to get the lay of the land in terms of the market and what's happened in the intervening years. So see you in another 5 years.